Hello. So yeah, thanks for coming to my talk. I'm just going to check if I go back. Yeah, that's better. So yeah, like was just said, I'm Andrew Harmel Law. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm a tech principal at ThoughtWorks. And I do a lot of domain-driven design. And so what I wanted to do, I kept getting asked questions about domain-driven design. And so I put a presentation together so I could send people a link to a recording of a talk instead of having to explain the same things over and over again. So what do I talk about when I talk about domain-driven design? Domain-driven design is, like I said, it's been around for a long time. It's super popular, and it's becoming even more popular. So you probably, maybe you're here because you haven't used domain-driven design, but you've heard the words domain-driven design coming up. Maybe you've heard people tell you that domain-driven design is the solution to all your problems. I agree. I think domain-driven design is the solution to all your problems, but there's a big difficulty. Domain-driven design is big, and it's complicated, and it keeps changing. And not everything you hear about DDD, I think, is actually true. So therefore, I'm going to tell you what I think is true. You can disagree with me, that's totally fine. But I'm going to tell you what I think it means. If you just want to, if you think you've made a mistake coming to this talk and you don't care about DDD, I can give you the one-sentence opinion of, or a one-sentence description of DDD. The one-sentence description is that it's an iterative, evolutionary approach to building software. And it's an approach to building software at all scales, from very small to very big. And the key thing that makes it different is that it focuses on the domain, so the problem domain or the business domain. That's where it looks, and it takes lessons learned from the problem or business domain, and it puts that directly into the software. It doesn't kind of look at the problem domain to understand it. It looks at it for the structure of the software that you're going to deliver. But there's a problem. So because that sounds a bit complicated, and one thing that's happened is architects have, I'm an architect, but people like me have taken over domain-driven design, and so domain-driven design is seen as an architecture thing, but it's not just an architecture thing, it's for developers too. It's for people who write software. So I'm going to hopefully explain what's going on. But domain-driven design is big, and it's been around for a long time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an approach which I've stolen from Netflix documentaries. So I'm sure you get Netflix. Everybody has Netflix, right? So you watch documentaries these days, and there's like a timeline, and things go backwards and forwards in the timeline, and then things become, you realize something happened in the past that was now important, right? So we're going to use a timeline approach. And so if I press the button, that's good. So we're going to go back in time. We're going to go so far back in time, we're going to go back to 1919, before anything to do with domain-driven design or computer software was ever really thought about. So maybe you recognize this. This is the Bauhaus. This is the second version of the Bauhaus. The first version of the Bauhaus was in Weimar in Germany in 1919. This second version was in Dessau, still in Germany, in 1929, I think. And the third version was in Berlin in the 1930s, which is, you can probably guess, was an exciting time to be in Berlin. The Bauhaus was founded by this gentleman here, Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius had fought in World War I and had seen a bunch of stuff that was not nice stuff at all. And so he came out of World War I determined to do what he said was to solve the problems of living in the world. So when he meant the world after World War I. Because he'd seen all of these terrible things happen. He'd seen countries go to war and trench warfare and all of this kind of stuff. So he didn't like that, so he wanted to solve this problem. And so he took a commission from some wealthy founders to set up this thing which he called the Bauhaus. So what was the Bauhaus? The Bauhaus was loads of different things. The Bauhaus was a school which taught people how to do design and architecture. But it was also a collective. It was a collection of human beings. So, and when he founded the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius explicitly brought together a bunch of people who didn't agree with each other, who had very different views, had very different skills, very different mindsets, and half of the things he spent time doing was trying to make sure that they didn't fall out with each other, because he wanted this collection of people who had all of these different insights to come together. But also, it was a practical thing. So lots of the stuff they did at the Bauhaus was all about making things. It wasn't purely philosophical and theoretical, it was real. So they fundamentally made things. They were a school, a collective, and they made things. And there was a unifying philosophy which wasn't originated by Gropius, but he kind of brought it as the unifying and motivating philosophy behind the Bauhaus, and it was this: form follows function. So form follows function did not start with Walter Gropius, but it was the thing that he said, everything needs to go towards this. And what it means is the shape of something or the design of something needs to come directly from what it's supposed to do. The thing that it's doing in the world comes from this. And so there was I already said there's a massive range of stuff. There's a massive range of stuff that the Bauhaus did. So the Bauhaus created teapots, which they sold to make money. They made, press the button again. They made chairs. Maybe you recognize this. This is a famous chair, the Brewer chair, which was designed by someone at the Bauhaus. They made parties, so like everything, right? As long as it, like the Bauhaus philosophy was there, they used it to do parties. They planned parties. They put on ballets because it was all creative things, right? But they're still things that happened in the outside world. They made, where is it gone? Art. Pay attention to this picture. This picture might come back later on. They made art. And even the school. So the second version of the Bauhaus was designed and created and populated and filled with things. The typeface, everything to do with the Bauhaus was designed by the Bauhaus. So it's this big collective of stuff. So that's the Bauhaus. We're now going to zoom forward into the future. Look at the picture. There's a reason why I chose the Bauhaus. So, 2003, the book Domain-Driven Design is published. And the key thing is that it again is trying to solve a problem. And the problem it's trying to solve is something that Eric Evans was worried about. Not the same as, how to cope with the aftermath of World War I, but he was seeing lots of people writing software, and they were making software really complicated. And his point was, they were making software complicated for the wrong reasons. They were making it complicated for technical reasons, and the bits they were getting wrong, because they were sucked into the technology, like Kubernetes and AWS and microservices, right? These are all since Eric, but he still saw this problem. People were getting sucked into the technical stuff, because we love the technical stuff. They weren't focusing on the complexity in the heart of software. The complexity in the heart of software was the business problem, the reason we're writing software in the first place, right? The reason that someone is paying us to write software. And so he wrote the book. The book, like the Bauhaus, is a massive range of stuff. There's tons of pieces in the Bauhaus. But all of it kind of fits together. So it's got patterns, it's got practices, it's got stories, it's got examples, it's got loads of different stuff, which is why the book is thick, and possibly why not as many people have read the book as would ideally happen, because there's tons in the book. But the book has a unifying philosophy as well. What's the unifying philosophy? Putting the model to work, which sounds similar to form follows function. Eric's whole point, and this is how you know you're doing DDD. If you're doing DDD, the model of the business problem, of the domain, of the world where the problem is, if you model that and put it to work, you put that model into your software, then you're doing DDD. That's it. That's all you need to do DDD. So that's his key unifying thing. So there were lots of bits of DDD as well. So DDD, like I said, had a wide range, just like from the teapots to the whole buildings, whole campuses of buildings. DDD has got the same thing, even in the Blue Book, 2003, before all of the other stuff. So there's bits you probably recognize. Number one, ubiquitous language is famous, massively misunderstood. But the problem is, there's a breakdown in communication, and we still see it today, right? Most of my job as a consultant is where I go in and people who have the problems are not managing to communicate to the people who solve the problems, the software engineers. They're not managing to get that problem across. So there's a breakdown in communication. Eric Evans spotted this in 2003. What you do is you get everyone in the problem space to speak, write, draw, and code using the same ubiquitous language. So if we call it, whatever the person in the business or the person in product or the person who's the non-technical person, the expert user, whatever you want to call them, whatever they are calling it, That's what it should say in the code, in the unit tests, in the stories, when you have a conversation, when you draw a picture on a whiteboard. That's ubiquitous language. Ubiquitous meaning everywhere, but like everywhere, even down in the code. Because people say, but even in the code, If I look at a code base, which is for a travel system, and I can't see like a flight, etc., then something's gone wrong, right? Next one, model-driven design. Here's your thing, right? So he knew that this was a problem, so he had a whole separate pattern just to remind you to get the problem into the code. The idea is you tie the code directly to the model. So that's what you do. So therefore, and you can therefore look for drifts. If you're looking at the code and you're trying to represent something in code based on a requirement or something that someone who understands the domain just said to you, if the code looks different from what they just explained, the code is wrong, the person who explained the problem is right, you need to fix the code to make the code look like the problem. Which is kind of fundamental, but we do it all the time, like still today. I've done it, everybody does it. Next one, some stuff in DDD is obvious, but it's still got a point in DDD. So modules is just like packages. If you do Java, he means packages. If you do C#, he means namespaces. But he doesn't just mean a place to put stuff. In DDD, packages are there to handle cognitive overload. So like when there's too much information, put a bunch of stuff you don't care about in a package with a good name, and the name comes from the domain. So then, like if it's to do with the police investigating a case, in a criminal trial, right? I don't care about how the police investigate a case, I just know that they investigate the case. So I put that in a folder called investigation. If I open the folder, I can see the details. If I leave the folder closed, then I don't need to know it, but I know it's to do with that thing. So that's what modules are for. Next up, entities. Sometimes representing the identity and the life cycle of a thing is important. So therefore, in an entity, not what we think of as entities today as like tables in a database, an entity in DDD is just represent the bit that changes and the bit that has a name or an identity. All the other pieces, you put into value objects. I thought I had a value. Value objects are like the boring bits. You put the boring bits in value objects, you put the key things about identity in an entity. Next up. Oh, there we go. Oh, this is hidden it. So these are aggregates, right? Nobody understands aggregates. They're called microservices. Everyone gets this wrong. Everyone says bounded contexts are microservices. They are not. Aggregates are microservices. If you read the blue book and you cross out the word aggregate and write the word microservice, the whole book makes sense. And maybe the whole book, you'll read the whole book because suddenly it makes sense. Because the problem is, with an aggregate, you need to keep closely associated things all transactionally compliant, right? They need to fit together. They need a consistent state. If we're distributing them across microservices, then we've got this whole problem of keeping distributed things in eventual consistency. We don't want that in certain levels of detail, so we have an aggregate which brings them all together like a bunch of grapes, right? You don't think of the individual grapes when you're just thinking about bunches of grapes. You think about a bunch of grapes. So you treat it as a thing that goes together. That's what aggregates do. So if you get nothing else from this talk, just go and read the chapter on aggregates, but replace it with the word microservices. And your world will be like, boom. Bounded context. Everybody talks about bounded context. I think they get it wrong all the time. The key thing is, if we have more than one model, if there's more than one mental model in the heads of the people whose problems we're trying to solve, then we need to keep them separate. A bounded context is just a line you draw around about a model to say this model is different from that model. Maybe this model talks about customer, this model talks about customer, but customer over here is like the marketing view of a customer, and customer over here is like the sales view of a customer, or the fulfillment, like the shipping view of a customer. It's the same customer in the real world, but we care about different things. So there's different models, so we put them in different bounded contexts. Sometimes you go crazy and you end up with too many bounded contexts and you draw a context map so you can see where everything goes. So you can see this goes from like the really small, there's even lower level concepts in DDD in the blue book, like how to name a method, all of this stuff, right? Really low level stuff, all the way up to how to organize your teams on a massive piece of work. That's all in the blue book. So, and to make matters worse, Eric, just cared about these two things here. So it's the same. This diagram is in the front and the back of the blue book, but I think nobody ever looks at it. So I took a really bad photograph and blew it up big. These are the only bits he cares about: ubiquitous language and model-driven design. If you're doing these two, then you're doing DDD. He doesn't care if you're using functional programming, if you're doing Scala or C# or JavaScript or whatever. He doesn't care if you're in the cloud or if you're on a mainframe or whatever. If you're doing those, then you're doing it. All of the other pieces are just patterns to help you solve a problem if you have a problem. You don't need to use modules and entities and services. You don't need to use these. You don't need to use any of these things, as long as you're doing those two. Again, people fall into, they're like, oh, I need to do the whole thing. You don't need to do the whole thing. You will probably end up using half of this, but you can use this and it tells you which page to go to. So then you have a problem and you read the page and it tells you what to do. So it's not laid out nicely. It's like chaos. Talking of chaos, we go back to the Bauhaus. So I said already that Walter Gropius, who's in the middle, the guy saying form follows function, he actively, at the very beginning, he wanted a collection of people who didn't agree with each other. And it was crazy. You can read the history. One guy started a cult. They all started shaving their hair. They became vegan, and they kind of dropped out of school. But that was the guy who ran the course which everybody had to take when they joined. So everybody had to take the course. He had to speak to the guy because there was a cult forming in the school. But the guy still taught. So Johannes Itten taught. But he took all these other people too. So again, there's famous Ukrainian Vasily Kandinsky, right? Who also more famous as an artist. He was a teacher at the Bauhaus. He taught about form in the foundation class, the importance of form. Because they're like, if you understand the very core concepts, you'll understand how to do everything, how to build buildings, how to make stuff. His friend Paul Klee taught the other half of the course, but taught about color. That's the one here. Meanwhile, on the other side, he missed the photo call, but Hannes Meyer, he was an architect, famously a communist and the first person to make money, which is kind of crazy. So he's doing both ends, playing both ends of the game, and also failing to get to the picture is Mies van der Rohe, also an architect. But also, interestingly, for the 1920s, one of the teachers is a woman. So it's not necessarily shown in the teaching staff, but I think the second or third year at the Bauhaus, there were more women students than there were men, and they could all take the same courses. So they really wanted to do stuff differently because they were like, oh, this creativity. Interestingly, Gunter Stonsel is the only one who's producing actual things that people can use. Like, you can put a nice picture on the wall, and maybe you live in a house. Gunter's making like rugs and stuff because she's like, this is how you take all of this theory and you make stuff with it, stuff that people use. So that's good, but things change over time. So the initial kind of chaos is hard to sustain. So things change. So the first thing that changes is hierarchy slowly starts creeping in, because humans tend towards hierarchy for good or for bad. This is what student accommodation looked like. There were less people than that in a single flat, but that's what a single student flat looked like. Teachers, meanwhile, had their own flats next door to each other, whereas separately, in the woods, nicely, kind of quiet, Gropius and his wife had a house. Their house is so big I couldn't find a picture of it. That's just the library. So there was a hierarchy appeared. But also commercialism starts kind of creeping in, and you could say that's a good thing or you could say that's a bad thing. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but like I say, the first person who runs the Bauhaus, who is also famously a communist, is also the first person who starts making money. So when Gropius ran it, it didn't make money. It was just like this big commune where everybody had fun. So let's go back here. This was cool for some people doing DDD. For other people doing DDD, this was not cool. So people were like, where do I start? So that, even after 2003, DDD is popular. Loads of people start coming to it. The internet is available. Everyone can do meetups, and DDD gets very popular in Europe. It gets very popular in North America. Lots of stuff starts kicking off. And so you then, in 2013, 10 years after the first book is published, you get this book called Implementing Domain-Driven Design by Vaughan Vernon, with a foreword by Eric Evans. So it's not like Vaughan took Eric's stuff and destroyed it. He was, blessed by Eric. And it solved the problem. The fundamental problem that was solved by Vaughan was people wanted to know how to do it. right? They were like, I love this DDD stuff, but someone please tell me where to start, because I don't know. I'm looking at the page, the book is thick. It's really hard to know where to start. So Vaughan writes Implementing Domain-Driven Design. It starts off with the same two things, model-driven design and ubiquitous language, but then it flips things, and this is where it gets interesting. Eric starts at the small stuff, entities, value objects, the programming coding level stuff, and then works his way up to the big stuff. Vaughan flips it and starts with the big stuff, which he now calls strategic design, or strategic DDD, which is now famous, which isn't really in the blue book. And he works his way down to what he calls tactical DDD, but it's just the small stuff, right? Like me typing, right? What I call a method, whether it's an entity or a value object, all that kind of stuff. So, sorry, there's a picture of all. And so what's he kind of doing? He's adding new things as well, right? So the DDD isn't staying static, DDD is continuing. So this is where you start seeing the word, despite the fact domain-driven design is called domain-driven design, Eric didn't really talk about what a domain is. So if someone wanted to know, so Vaughan comes in and says, with a bunch of other people, this is what a domain is. A domain is how you represent what you think the world should look like, next door to what the world really looks like. And the idea is you want bounded contexts, which are the smaller bubbles like this, right? And this one here, you want them to align to the domain, because that means your software is aligned to the business. So if you do DDD, you get this. But everyone was doing DDD, didn't have this. They were like, yeah, but I've got 17 different types of customer on 15 different types of database, and they're all spread everywhere. And some of these databases are just doing old stuff and some are doing new stuff. That's why this appeared. Events came in. Events which are now, like, because of Alberto Brandolini jumping around in his orange hooded tops, if anyone's seen Alberto. Events are like, some people think the only part of DDD that's important. They weren't even in the blue book. They get mentioned once, where Eric has a little debate with himself as to whether an event is a entity or a value object, and he doesn't decide. Here, events are big, right? They're a big thing, they're in the book, and events are popular and they work, and so then Alberto Brandolini came up with event storming, so it's all taken off. But basically, if something's important in the domain, you capture it as an event. The big next one was, this is awesome, but how do I turn all of this domain model into software? Ports and adapters come along, which lets you save data to a database, or expose a REST interface to get some stuff, or listen to a queue. All of these things. I think there's one more. No, there's not. So this is good. So all of these extra things, these implementing things come along, because Vaughan Vernon's stuck them in, right, which is good. But the problem is, some of the chaos, some of the, you just need this bit if you just pick this piece up. Only do layered architecture if you want layered architecture. That's kind of disappeared. People now think, oh, I need to do this. And now I've got to read the blue book and the red book. And the red book is also thick. Plus there's a thing with cowboys, if you've read the red book. I'm not sure why the cowboys are there. There's a whole story with cowboys. And it feels like you've got to start at the top at strategic design and do your domains and then do your bounded context and then all of these things, and then you get bored before you get anywhere near the stuff which is in the code. For me, and it wasn't an intention of the book when it was created, but the key thing is if you are doing DDD, the key thing is it's got into the code. So if you do what's now called tactical DDD, the small stuff, if you have entities, if you have value objects, if you have just methods and classes and things, functions which have the words, they're named the same as the idea in the head of your domain expert, you're doing DDD. You don't need microservices, you don't need any of this sort of stuff, right? And you can grow up to do the strategic stuff, or you can start at the strategic stuff and organize your teams and do all the other stuff, and then work your way down. But if you don't get to the bottom, if the language doesn't get into the code, you're not doing DDD. And the problem is, this put the language in the code a long way away. It's near the back of the book. Nobody reads to the end of books. I read the third attempt at reading the blue book was when I finished the blue book. So it's, I think something, it got structured, but things got lost. So, part 3. So, as I said at the start, the Bauhaus, the third version of the Bauhaus was in 1930s Berlin. And like I said, 1930s Berlin was a hard place to run an art school which tolerated difference of opinion and all these different things, right? So Mies van der Rohe, who is the third person who ran the Bauhaus, he's not famous for running the Bauhaus because most of his job was trying to stop it being shut down every 3 weeks. So not much interesting stuff came out of the Bauhaus. And then eventually they just decided to give up and break away, right? So they just spread all around the world. And the thinking and the philosophy and the mindset of the Bauhaus, in many different ways, spread out and went all over the place. For example, Harvard pays Walter Gropius to come across and set up a new Bauhaus, but with old men in grey suits, right? So this is in the 1950s. Compared to the 1920s, they look like they've gone back in time, but they've actually gone forward in time. So that kind of didn't work. Gropius was kind of just like an old man and just kind of, disappeared and started doing his own thing. Meanwhile, somewhere else in America, someone paid some of the other Bauhaus original teachers to go to form this place called Black Mountain, which is still going, and the spirit of the Bauhaus is totally alive at Black Mountain. So, like lots of famous students became teachers. If you're interested, because I love this stuff, if you're interested, you can Google it. There's tons of cool stuff that's going on at Black Mountain. And then Mies van der Rohe, he goes to America. He's now, maybe, along with Vasily Kandinsky and Paul Klee, he's maybe one of the three most famous people because he went to America and started building loads of buildings in America. And then he comes back to Europe and he's on a stamp in Germany because he built a big library, which apparently is not very good. I think it's not a library, it's the National Gallery of Germany, which apparently is bad for the artworks, but looks quite nice. So maybe he didn't do a great job. But all of them are still saying form still follows function, right? So the philosophy, in very different ways, is still living in what they're doing. And so the same thing happens with domain-driven design, right? So now it's kind of out in the world. There's all the stuff that Eric Evans did, plus all the people who are excited about it, plus the book that Vaughan Vernon wrote, plus tons of other stuff. There's if you Google DDD, there's a lot of stuff, right? And it went everywhere. And DDD spread out, but you can kind of trace it back to two different flavors of DDD, which hopefully I've kind of explained where they're the same, but they're slightly different. This is the one and it's possibly because of which book you read first. I read this book first, so I think this is where it comes from. So there's people who kind of talk about DDD and it comes from this area. There's people who talk about DDD and it comes from this area. And there's very subtle differences, but you can see it from which bits they give more emphasis to and more weight to. So now, before we get to the end, what I want to do is share with you and maybe do a quiz to see if anyone can shout out things that have come from DDD but aren't necessarily DDD. So you don't need to do these to be doing DDD, but they've come from and have been heavily influenced by. So hopefully this gives you an idea of things that have come out of DDD. So the first one, it's not a quiz because it says it already. The first one is CQRS. So architects around the world love CQRS. I've tried to build systems with CQRS, and there's a reason architects love it and developers don't, because it's super powerful and it uses domain language multiple models. It doesn't use aggregates. CQRS aggregates are different from Blue Book aggregates, but nobody talks about it. So that's where I've seen loads of things go wrong. And it majors on events. It's super powerful, but it's hard, really hard. Like even Greg Young, who kind of invented it, you do Greg Young's training course, he spends almost the first 10 minutes of every day reminding you shouldn't use CQRS unless you're really sure, because it's probably won't, he's like, there's easier ways to solve your problem unless your problem is really hard. So CQRS. Next one is microservices, the famous one. This is the first reason why. So Eric Evans, I heard him say once, he wrote the book and it was famous and then it went away and nobody talked to him about it. Then something came along and suddenly he got invited to conferences again and then it went quiet. And then something else happened and he got invited to conferences again and then it went quiet. The first major time he got invited to conferences was when microservices came along. Because microservices, all green ticks. Microservices, I think the only way to succeed by doing microservices is if you're using DDD to find out what your microservices are, aggregates. If you do that, then your split will be right, and you will not have coupled teams, and you will have transactional integrity, and your data will work, and you won't have too much connectivity. You will be amazed how well it works if you do DDD. If you get it wrong, then you get the backlash against microservices, which everybody talks about, right? But yeah, microservices definitely were one of the early reasons why Eric Evans started coming out of, not retirement, but coming back to stand on stages and talk about stuff. Next up is event storming. This was the next reason why Eric Evans started getting asked to do talks. So ThoughtWorks, we have it on our tech radar because as consultants who come into companies and we know all about software delivery and product and data and AI and all this stuff, we don't know about your business because that's your job. You know about your business. Event sourcing is like an awesome way of getting everybody in the room to figure out exactly what the domain is and what the problems are and how you can split it up. The best thing about event sourcing is it uses loads of different colored Post-it notes. It's not technical. It forces technical people to stop talking about technology and start talking about the business. That's genius. That's like Alberto. There's a bunch of stuff, but there's 2 workshops for different types of event storming. They're super powerful because suddenly you can have a way of all getting into the same room, technical people and non-technical people, and having a conversation. So it's really good. And you can see it's got ticks everywhere. Events, business focus, and complexity, where if you draw this, you capture all the Post-it notes. If it looks complicated, that's because it's complicated. Multiple models, you find bounded context, you see aggregates, you see team splits, you use ubiquitous language. All of this comes for free. And you don't need to know about any of this to do event storming. You just get people to write the events, the thing that happened, on an orange sticky note and stick it on the board. And it just magically happens. It's amazing. There is a book which Alberto hasn't finished writing, which is 80% complete. Like every now and then it gets like 81% complete, 82% complete. Maybe if I shame him publicly enough, then he'll finish the book. But it's really good. So it's worth paying for, but it's not complete. There's bits which go, Alberto, I should need to finish this paragraph because I haven't finished it. Next one is team topologies. So team topologies has come out of the DevOps world. It's not come out of the DDD world. But there's a whole bit about, right, this is awesome. It tells us how to identify teams and how to have relationships between teams. The thing it builds on top of DDD is it goes, to make this work, you need to know what the ownership and the focus of the team is. And it doesn't just use DDD. It says there's other ways too, which is correct. DDD is not the only way to break up your software. But what it says is, use domain-driven design to identify your bounded context. A team will own one or more bounded contexts. One or more bounded contexts will contain, each bounded context will contain a model, and each model will have one or more aggregates. Simple, right? Nobody's sharing any code. Everyone's got nice, clean relationships between the code. It just magically works. It doesn't just magically work. You've got to put the effort in. But so team topologies famously is another reason why DDD has come back. And the last one that's come back is data mesh. This is the current reason why Eric Evans is back talking again. DDD Europe takes place next month. And there is tons of stuff on the agenda about data mesh. And data mesh is basically data scientists getting a bit jealous of software engineers and how we have this awesome thing called DDD to understand all of our different models. And data scientists are like, we've got models too. Can we use DDD? So Zamak, who's a thought worker, looked at it and put the two together and came up with this incredibly powerful thing. So instead of a data lake, right, which is just a big pile of stuff where you put all of your data, she proposes data mesh where you have individual data context, right? Data-bounded context, which have a specific model and a specific job. So it's not just swimming in data, it's like specific data from specific places to do a specific job, to solve a problem for the business users who might, maybe it's a product that you're building, like a data product, or maybe it's reports or insights or whatever. They're still products you're building for your business users, right? So use DDD. And it has business focus, bounded context, and multiple models. Other bits it doesn't take, it doesn't need to. And so then that lets me bring it back to the end. So hopefully that's like a super fast tour of DDD. And there's there's a reason why there's loads of stuff around about the world of DDD. Number one, it's been around a long time. So therefore, and people have used it because it's useful. So it's spread out and people have picked it up and done different things with it. But because it's been around a long time and people have tried to use it to solve different problems, there's all of these different things which have popped up. And so there's lots of noise, good noise and bad noise around about things. And also because I think I'll definitely admit, I've tried to convince lots of my clients to read the DDD book before. So even someone whose native language is English, the DDD book is a bit thick and a bit hard to read. And I tried to convince a load of North Macedonians to read the book, and some of them loved it and some of them hated it. Some Norwegians, some of them loved it, some of them hated it. Some Ukrainians, some of them loved it, some of them hated it. So it's not easy to read, the blue book. I don't think the red book's easy to read either. But there's tons of stuff in there and you don't need to read it all. But there's a few key things. And this is the big one. If someone tells you you're doing domain-driven design, but the thing at the core of what you're doing is not speaking to and listening to and understanding and creating together with your business users, with your domain experts, with your product, the people who understand the problem, if you are not listening to them and co-creating a model which gets into code, you're not doing DDD. You may be 90% doing DDD, but if it doesn't get into code, you've failed, which is, I feel sorry for you, and you can pay me to come in and help you fix the last 10%, but that's you can get so close and be really good, but not get the thing, because the fundamental bit about DDD is, as I said at the start, it's iterative and it's evolutionary. DDD, you don't get it right first time. You speak to your domain experts, or you speak to your people with the key problems. You build a language together, the ubiquitous language, and then you build models. Then you ship those models into production, and you realize that those models are wrong, or they can't do everything you need them to do. So you go back and you refactor. XP, refactoring, test-driven development, continuous delivery are all baked into DDD, because Eric knew all of the Kent Beck and all of Martin Fowler and all of those folks coming up with XP. He doesn't think you're going to get this right first time. You've got to go around and keep going around, right? There's a whole chapter about breakthroughs, which is where you do some DDD and your model breaks because it doesn't work anymore. But that's good because you get insight and then you fix your model to make it work. And maybe it splits into two models, or maybe you just get a better model. So the key thing is, to do that, you've got to ship it to production and you've got to get the feedback. And so that's what I wanted to kind of close with. DDD is old and it's hard and it's big, but it can be really modern, really small, and really fresh. And it's like super, aligned to building the right code for the right people, solving customer problems, which is very much what we try and do just now. And so I would encourage everybody to try DDD, even just read the two, the bits, the dark bubbles. Just read those bits and see what happens. And I reckon it'll transform how you do software development. If anybody has, I'm almost done. If anybody has any questions, I'm going to hang around a little bit afterwards. But hopefully that was useful and hopefully it made sense to people. Thank you.